But to me, atheism isn't something that can necessarily be true or false any more than, say, veganism. Is veganism true? It's not really a case of whether it's true or false.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. So today, we're breaking down a fascinating exchange between Christian apologist Frank Turek and young atheist philosopher Alex O'Connor. And honestly, this is one of those debates where you can actually watch someone's argument fall apart in real time. Frank tries to use the existence of evil to prove God exists, but Alex comes in with a clarity that just cuts through every single assumption Frank makes. You're going to want to stick around for this entire breakdown, because the way Alex handles the burden of proof discussion is something every skeptic needs to understand. Also, let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from. I love seeing how global this community is getting. All right, let's get into it.
With you, Frank, just to lay out, briefly at least, what the case is that you're making on the video that Alex was responding to.
Right, it's a 2-minute video, and I say in the front, you can't cover this whole issue in 2 minutes, but my main point is this, is that if evil exists, then good must exist, and in order for good to exist, God must exist, because by definition, what we mean by good is the nature of God. That's what goodness is. So you can't have evil unless good exists, because evil is a privation or a lack in good. Evil is like rust in a car. If you take all the rust out of the car, you got a better car. If you take all the car out of the rust, you've got nothing. In other words, evil only exists as a parasite in good. And so I think we all agree evil exists. The question is, if evil exists, then how can it exist unless there's a standard of good? And good won't exist unless God exists. So evil doesn't disprove God. Evil may prove there's a devil out there, but evil doesn't disprove God, because there'd be no such thing as evil unless there was good, and there'd be no such thing as good unless God existed. Now, the second question there, of course, is, okay, well, if there is a good God, why would he allow these evil things to occur? That's another question,
right?
Which we spend a lot of time in the book, Stealing from God. But my main point is that if evil exists, God exists. I know it sounds counterintuitive.
It does sound counterintuitive to the average person. They'll say, how do you get from one to the other? But as I understand it, this is if you like, this is the idea of what's often called the moral argument for God. That you, if we all agree that real right and wrong exist, real good and evil exist, then there has to be some kind of a moral lawgiver or some kind of reference frame that beyond just the material universe that a naturalist perhaps believes.
In fact, C.S. Lewis famously said that as an atheist, my argument against God was that the universe seems so cruel and unjust. But how would I got this idea of justice and injustice? A man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line. What was I comparing this universe with when I called it unjust? You see, injustice can't exist unless justice exists, and justice can't exist unless God exists, because, again, by definition, that's what we mean by justice.
And so it's your view that if an atheist wants to claim that justice and injustice exist, well, they can't really, because that's just, on their framework, an illusion, a kind of just a sort of something that we've come up with as a sort of helpful way of thinking about things, but not something that actually exists objectively.
Right, typically, and I think that's what Alex said in his video, that it's an illusion, that this idea that we have these objective moral values is illusory.
Well, let's come to Alex for this, and we'll try and sort of take the points that you raised in the video in a kind of sequential manner as far as possible, Alex. But let's start at the beginning, because in the video, the first point you wanted to make was that there is this question mark around disproving atheism. That's obviously the title of the video. It may just be that evil disproves atheism. You have a problem with that very concept to start with, don't you?
To an extent, yeah. It's not particularly pertinent to the discussion, but I think it's important to remember that according to me, atheism isn't a worldview, and I know this is something you disagree with, Frank, but the way that people get around this a lot of the time is they'll say, well, many atheists do believe that there is no God. But not all atheists do. So if you meet a person who does believe there is no God, they are an atheist. But that's not what atheism is. That's sort of a subset of atheism. I'm what you might call an agnostic atheist. And a lot of people think that agnosticism and atheism are on the sort of same spectrum, but to me they're absolutely not. Agnosticism, Matt Dillahunty is good on this. Agnosticism is a claim to knowledge. Atheism is a claim to belief. So to say you're agnostic is to say, well, I don't know if there's a God, which I think is the rational position to take. I mean, can anybody really know for sure? And all I'm saying is, because I don't know agnosticism, I therefore don't believe, and that's atheism. But there are people out there who do actively believe there's no God, and those people do have a burden of proof. I mean, people such as He only did it on one occasion that I've seen, but Christopher Hitchens usually would say, we would never say there is no God. But when talking to William Lane Craig, he said of the Christian God that he is quite dangerously, I think, but he said that he's in a position where he thinks he can actively say that God does not exist. And in that case, yes, he has a burden of proof. But as far as I'm concerned, atheists in general, or atheism, isn't a worldview and doesn't...
It isn't something you can therefore disprove in that sense.
Yeah, in the sense, and also atheism, one of the phrases that I've heard you use, Frank, is on atheism, if atheism is true.
This is exactly where religious apologists lose the plot. Frank just laid out his entire moral argument, and it all hinges on one massive assumption that he never proves. He says good can only exist if God exists because by definition, good is the nature of God. Wait, hold on. By whose definition? That's not a definition, that's theological presupposition dressed up as philosophy. And here's what gets me. C.S. Lewis gets quoted here with the whole crooked line analogy, right? A man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line. Sounds brilliant until you realize it completely dodges the actual question. Where does that standard come from? Frank just assumes it has to be God without ever demonstrating why it has to be God specifically. Could be evolution, could be social contract, could be a dozen other explanations. But nope, straight to God with zero justification. Then Alex comes in and immediately cuts through all of this. He points out something Frank desperately wants to avoid. Atheism isn't a worldview. And Matt Dillahunty's breakdown is perfect here. Agnosticism deals with knowledge. Atheism deals with belief. Frank wants atheism to be this big claim so he can demand proof, but Alex is saying, no, I'm not claiming there's no God. I'm saying I don't believe your claim that there is one. Massive difference. And notice how Alex frames it. He says anyone can really know for sure. Can anybody? Because the honest answer is no. Nobody knows. Frank doesn't know. He believes. There's a difference between confidence and knowledge, and religious apologists constantly conflate the two.
But to me, atheism isn't something that can necessarily be true or false any more than, say, veganism. Is veganism true? It's not really a case of whether it's true or false. It's a case of the tenets on which you are grounding this veganism is perhaps maybe you think it's wrong to eat animals. That can be true or false. But not objectively, I'd say. But that can be true or false. But then to say, is veganism itself true or false? That doesn't make any sense. It's not whether it's true or false. It's, are you a vegan or are you not?
Okay.
Frank?
Yeah, well, I would say that are you saying that atheism is just a lack of belief in God?
It is for me, as far as I'm concerned.
Okay, well, then that would be just a statement about your psychological state.
Yes.
It wouldn't be a statement about the real world.
Well,
because
no.
this book is an atheist then, because it lacks a belief in God. But then we're really trivializing what the word atheist means then.
Yes.
Because you could say this microphone's an atheist then, if it just lacks a belief in God. So if somebody wants to say that, okay, fine, but I don't see atheists just saying that. What I see is atheists saying, oh, I lack a belief in God, and here's how I explain the universe. Multiple universes, evolution, quantum vacuums, materialism. Well, those are positive beliefs that need to be defended. In other words, you just can't say, I lack a belief in God, and therefore I have no burden of proof to have a conversation about why reality is the way it is. No, if you're going to say that multiple universes or evolution or materialism or quantum vacuums explain how we got here, then it would seem to me you'd need reasons for those. Those are positive beliefs. You see what I mean?
Oh, absolutely. In certain cases. For instance, if you're talking about the variety of life, and somebody says to me that they think it was God, and I said, oh no, I can explain this through evolution. I suddenly have a burden of proof. I have to offer some evidence for that.
Right.
But atheism in general, if you're just an atheist and you're not taking part in debate, I think you don't necessarily have to justify your position.
What do you do with the
same
problem
way.
that makes cats and rocks and microphones atheists as well?
Well, it depends on your definition. For instance, if we define a vegan as someone who doesn't eat meat, then this book is also a vegan.
Right. Yes, but isn't that the point, that makes it difficult to understand what the content is of
I don't
such
think it makes it difficult to understand.
point of view?
I think it's something which applies to humans. You can call a human an atheist. If you want to call a book an atheist, then be my guest, because by my definition, an atheist is someone who does not believe in God. And so a book, sure, call it an atheist if you will.
But then we wouldn't have any reason to converse about anything. If you're just saying you lack a belief in God, and I don't have any burden of proof to explain reality or why reality is the way it is, then we're not really having a conversation, right?
Well, there's two types of atheist speakers, you might say. The first is people who will have a burden of proof, who come out and there are two people trying to prove their opposing worldviews against each other. In the other case, there's somebody like me who, in the face of certain aspects of Christianity, I've found to be not particularly compelling, or particularly, I'm trying not to use moral terms here, to be very careful. But and so what I will do, my mission.
This is where Frank's argument completely collapses. Alex just delivered one of the cleanest analogies I've ever heard. He compares atheism to veganism. Is veganism true or false? The question doesn't even make sense. Veganism is a position, not a truth claim. Same with atheism. It's a response to a claim, not a claim itself. And watch what Frank does next. He tries this absurd reductio where he says, well, then this book is an atheist because it lacks belief in God. And Alex just calmly shuts it down. Yeah, if you want to call a book an atheist, go ahead. Because by definition, an atheist is someone who doesn't believe in God. Frank thought he had a gotcha moment, but all he did was expose that he doesn't understand basic categorical definitions. But here's the part that really shows Frank's desperation. He says, you can't just say you lack belief and have no burden of proof to explain reality. Wrong. If you make a claim that God exists, you have the burden to prove it. Alex doesn't have to prove anything. He's not making a claim. He's rejecting yours. That's how burden of proof works in literally every other context. And then Frank tries to say, well, atheists believe in multiple universes, evolution, materialism, so those need defending. Sure, if an atheist makes those claims, but atheism itself? Just a lack of belief, nothing more. Frank wants to pack all this extra baggage onto atheism so he can attack a straw man instead of dealing with the actual position. The whole books and microphones thing was embarrassing for Frank. He thought he was being clever, but he just revealed he's arguing against a caricature he made up in his head instead of what Alex actually believes.
He's very smart.
My mission is not to come out and convert everyone to atheism. It's rather to say, well, here's a belief system that I don't agree with, and here's why. I'm then leaving it open. Perhaps if I'm debating with a Christian, I might say, well, this is why I think Christianity isn't true. Now go and do your own thing. Maybe you want to be a Muslim. Maybe you want to be an atheist like me.
All right, let me ask you this, though. Let's just say that you say you think Christianity is false because of X, whatever that is, right?
Sure.
Aren't you implying that non-X then is true?
Not necessarily. Again, it's a very subtle distinction between believing there is no God and not believing there is a God. It sounds like the same thing. It sounds like we're being pedantic, but really, in all honesty, it is a semantic thing. It doesn't particularly matter because, for instance, what we're discussing today, the idea of evil proving or disproving God. I don't think it particularly matters how you're defining atheism or Christianity, because what we're trying to talk about is a particular concept. And so for this discussion, I might just be a skeptic, not necessarily an atheist, but I might just be somebody who you are trying to present a worldview to, and I'm just saying, well, let me criticize that and see if I can get some kind of response.
When I've had this conversation on Twitter and on this show with people, sometimes what's emerged is that they will say, they'll go with the atheism is just a lack of belief in God view. But then when you press them a bit, they will come out with other things that they do have positive beliefs about. So that there is no such thing as objective moral right or wrong.
Right.
The universe has no purpose. All that exists is matter and motion ultimately, and those kinds of things. So do you subscribe in that sense to something like, for instance, materialism, naturalism, and so on?
Well, for me, it's a case-by-case basis.
Okay.
So I wouldn't call myself a naturalist. I wouldn't call myself a materialist, because all of a sudden you're giving yourself a burden of proof. What I would say is, if you pressed me to put some money, I'm not a gambling man, but if I had to put some money on either say Christianity or naturalism, a better explanation for the universe, I'd put my money on naturalism.
Okay.
And so when I have discussions like this, I will argue in that mindset.
Yeah.
But I'm not going to say...
But you're still agnostic, effectively, as to what exactly...
If you're talking about a claim to knowledge, absolutely. I would never be so arrogant as to say that I know that there is no God, or I would never say that I know that there is someone up there, and I know who he is, I know his gender, I know his nature, and I know what his plan is and what he wants for me.
Yeah.
Well, I think we're dealing in the burden. We're dealing more with probability than we are with absolute certainty. And you remember Richard Dawkins famously said this on a scale of 1 to 7, where 1 is I'm sure God exists, to 7 I'm sure there isn't a God. He said I'm a 6.5. To his credit, he says, look, I can't say with absolute certainty there is no God. Okay,
Yes.
So we're all dealing in the realm of probability. So where would you be on that scale?
I'm in the same place as Dawkins. I'm a number 6. He calls it a de facto atheist, which I think is the perfect term for all intents and purposes.
You assume there is no God for all intents and purposes.
For all intents and purposes. What I would say is, rather than I assume there is no God, rather I think that everything seems to work without the assumption that a God is there.
But wouldn't an agnostic be about a 3.5?
Agnosticism, again, is a claim to knowledge rather than to belief. So agnosticism, to me, if you don't call yourself an agnostic, then I can't quite understand what knowledge you have that I don't. I mean, I don't know if you're the sort of person to say, I know there is a God.
Again, it's the realm of probability.
And here we get to the heart of what makes Alex's approach so intellectually honest compared to Frank's. Alex straight up says his mission isn't to convert people to atheism. His mission is to critique belief systems he finds unconvincing and let people figure out the rest themselves. Compare that to Frank, whose entire career is built on converting people to Christianity. One of these approaches respects intellectual autonomy. The other one doesn't. Alex also makes this crucial distinction that Frank keeps ignoring. He says he wouldn't call himself a naturalist or materialist, because that gives him a burden he's not interested in taking on. But if pressed, if he had to put money on what explains the universe better, Christianity or naturalism, he'd pick naturalism. And that's perfectly reasonable. You can have a working hypothesis without claiming absolute certainty. Then comes one of the most honest statements in this entire discussion. Alex says he would never be so arrogant as to claim he knows there's no God, and he would never claim to know there is someone up there and know exactly who he is and what his plan is. Think about that for a second. Who sounds more arrogant? The person saying, I don't know, or the person saying, I absolutely do know, and here's every detail about this being's nature and desires? Frank operates in a world of certainty that he cannot possibly justify. Alex operates in a world of probability and honesty about the limits of human knowledge. And that's the fundamental difference. Religious apologists demand certainty from atheists while offering nothing but assertions themselves. Meanwhile, Alex is sitting there saying, look, I don't claim to have all the answers. I just don't find your answers convincing. And that's completely valid. The Richard Dawkins scale comes up, and Alex puts himself at a 6. Same as Dawkins. De facto atheist. Meaning, for all practical purposes, he assumes no God, but he's not making an absolute knowledge claim. Frank wants atheism to be a dogmatic assertion so he can attack it. But that's not what it is. It never was. And Alex just spent this entire segment proving that. So what do you guys think of this? Leave your thoughts down in the comments. Please like and subscribe, and I will see you in the next video.